Hey class, welcome back. I hope you guys are all doing well. In today's lecture, we're going to be looking at the Second World War with the North African campaign. We'll be spending a good number of lectures on the Second World War, looking at different theaters and different campaigns. Today we're going to be looking at the North African campaign, where the Italians and the Germans, which the Germans are under General Erwin Rommel, and the Africa Corps, will be fighting against the British and then the Americans in North Africa. And then we're going to switch gears and begin to look at the Pacific War with the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. We're going to look at the reasons why they bombed it, and then we're going to look at the bombing itself in this PowerPoint lecture coming up. Now, as I did before, I recommended some books if you like to research this more or do some study on it more, or maybe just read about it. And today I brought two books from my library. This one here is called An Army at Dawn by Rick Atkinson. An Army at Dawn. And this is the book on the war in North Africa, 1942 to 1943. And Rick Atkinson does a great job outlining in detail the opening battles, the Africa Corps, and then the invasion of the Americans with Operation Torch in western North Africa when the Americans joined the war later on. So that's a really good book. Highly recommend it, An Army at Dawn. And then also, we're not going to talk into great detail of this because it was kind of looked at as a kind of a minor campaign, but in reality it was not, because it brought Hitler to his knees even faster, was the war in Sicily and Italy, when the Americans, after they defeated Rommel in North Africa, they moved on and they hopped over to Sicily, and then they hopped over to Italy, coming in the bottom of Italy, in the bottom of the boot, and moving up Italy. And there were some very famous battles, but when Hitler finally fell, the Americans still had not gone all the way up through Italy. And so we're not going to spend a lot of time on Italy. I wish I could. But if you want to read up more on that, again, by the same author, Rick Atkinson, it's called The Day of Battle, and this is the war in Sicily and Italy, 1943 to 1944. And so just two books. If you want to do some more research on that, I'd recommend those two. But other than that, we're going to move now into the PowerPoint and look at North Africa. Okay, class, we're going to have the PowerPoint lecture for the Second World War, Part 2. When we look at the war, we have to break it down in different areas to speak about. And this could be geographical, like we have here on the screen. It could be chronological, which I do have the dates on the screen, but I'm going to try to kind of overlap the different theaters with what's going on in the specific theater during the entire time the events take place in that theater, except that at the very end, in an upcoming lecture, I'm kind of draw it all together where the Allies win in each theater. So, especially European and Pacific. So, on the screen there, you see the main theaters of World War II. And even though the war goes across the world and there's many different areas involved and other countries involved in what we've talked about, we have the European theater, the North African theater, and the Pacific theater. Obviously, the European theater was 1939 to 45, with the invasion of Poland in 39 and the fall of Germany in 45. And in there we have the Poland campaign, with the invasion of Poland in 39. Western Front is from 40 to 45, and that is going to be with the invasion of France by Germany, the fortification of France, especially the northern coast, where you think of the invasion of Normandy and D-Day, the Western Front. And then the Eastern Front is from 41 to 45, and that is the invasion of Russia by the German forces, and then they would then be pushed back. North Africa was from 1940 to 43, and the reason that the North African campaign occurred was because Italy decided to start doing some things down in Africa, and they got in trouble in 1940, and so Germany had to come to their rescue. And so we have the North African campaign with the Africa Corps from 41 to 43. And what that really did was it sidetracked Hitler. He never really had a plan for taking over Africa, but once he started getting a role in Africa and having some success there under Erwin Rommel, he realized that it showed his power, and so he exploited that. He exploited that. And then the third theater for the Second World War was the Pacific Theater, 1941 to 45, and that's the island hopping campaign after Pearl Harbor, where the Marines, for the most part, the U.S. Marines would go from island to island. There were also some pretty significant naval battles that take place. So that would end up pushing all the way to the homeland of Japan. So we see the three theaters of World War II. And we'll be going through all of these. And when we go through these, we'll then wrap it up at the end with a lecture on the end of the war, where the Allies win and the Axis lose. Okay, so we're going to start with the North African Theater. 1940 to 43, Italy declares war on Great Britain on June 10th, 1940. The British Army in Egypt invade neighboring Italian Libya. And we'll have some maps coming up, but when Italy declared war on Great Britain decides to leap over the border in Egypt. Obviously, they're at war now, so Egypt takes the offensive. The British take the offensive, and they invade neighboring Italian Libya. Great Britain captures Italian forts and actually destroys a very large army, the Italian 10th Army. And so Mussolini, he has really no choice but to call out for help from his ally Adolf Hitler. And so Germany comes to help, and in February 1941, German general, he would become a field marshal, German General Erwin Rommel arrives with the German Africa Corps. You may have heard of them before, you may have seen them in a movie or something, but this is the German army in North Africa, and they operated for a couple of years under Rommel's command. He was known as the Desert Fox because he was very wise in his military strategy and use of forces, and especially use of tanks. And basically he came in there and he rescued the Italians that were remaining and set up operations in North Africa, and pretty much takes control of a lot of North Africa. And he halts the destruction of the Axis forces. Well, then Rommel decides to go on the offensive and pushes the British back. Again, this is before the United States entered the war. There's General Erwin Rommel there on the screen. He would be a field marshal, which is like the highest ranking you can get. There were several field marshals in the German military. Born 1891, lived till 1944 because he got embroiled in the plot to assassinate Hitler in 1944, the July 20th plot, and basically he was given the honorable way out of the German military by giving the opportunity to commit suicide, which he did, and killed himself in 1944. Known for his brilliant leadership in North Africa and later in France, because he would control or command the forces in northern France as the Allies invade France in 1944. He would be the one that would be in control of setting up the defenses and making sure that the German military was ready for the invasion. He was a lead from the front, kind of a general. He inspired the troops. He was a World War I veteran. He wrote a book called Infantry Attacks, which is basically a baseline strategy for ground warfare. There's a couple pictures of him there in his command car on the upper left. His tanks, a couple pictures of his tanks moving across the desert. So you can see the terrain, very dusty, dirty, open land. I mean, it was perfect for tank warfare, and he was an expert on the ground forces. So he was very successful. Now, the way you can study the Afrika Korps and the battles that take place is going by battle and seeing the movements, but we don't have time for any of that. So I have this map here on the screen, which kind of shows the movements. Now, this is North Africa, and you can see Egypt over here. So if you can just kind of get in your mind the location in Africa. So here's Egypt, and then neighboring Libya. Now, Africa's going to continue this way for a good distance, and we'll see another map coming up with that later. But you can kind of see the back and forth of the battles that take place in North Africa. So here's Egypt, and the British invade Libya and begin to beat the Italians. Well, then they call for help, and so the Afrika Korps arrives, and you can see here the blue line is the British. And from December of 40 to February 41, they move from this line all the way to here, to El Agailer. And then Rommel shows up, and from March of 41 to May of 41, he has a lot of success, and he pushes the British all the way back, okay, to here. And then all the way back here, so it's kind of a back and forth. That's the point I want you to get, is that they move back and forth across this sea of sand. And then from January 42 to September 42, Rommel does a really good push, and he comes all the way to El Alamein, which you may have heard of. That's a pretty famous battle there, El Alamein. And then in October 42 to January 43, on the scene comes General Montgomery, which we'll see here in a minute, and he shows up here, and he pushes Rommel all the way back and even further. And then by now, the Americans have landed in Operation Torch and begin to push from West Africa along the upper coast to kind of pinch the Germans between Montgomery and the American forces, which we'll see in a little bit. Another picture of the Afrika Korps, just a tank going across the desert. Okay, so here's General Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. He's British. 1887 to 1976. That's the year that I was born, in 1976. It's the year that he died. Nicknamed Monty, he won the Battle of El Alamein, October to November 42, against Rommel. After many setbacks, finally a British strong victory. He becomes a national hero, and his name becomes a household name. And then he would also command British forces in France after D-Day, June 6, 1944. All right, so continuing on with the North African theater, after the U.S. bombing of the Japanese bombing of the U.S. forces in Pearl Harbor, which we're going to be talking about Pearl Harbor coming up, in December of 1941, after that puts America on a mobilization operation to get ready for the war, and Great Britain was asking for more help, and now that the United States was at war against Japan, and then there was declarations of war by Germany on the United States, the United States decided we need to get into the war, and so they decide to invade West and North Africa in an operation called Operation Torch. And really, at the beginning of it, they begin to fight against Vichy French forces. So when you look at a map of Northwest Africa with Morocco and the different countries there, well, those areas are controlled by Vichy French forces, which are loyal to the Germans. And so that's where the Americans decide to land. And then they move east to pinch the German forces against the British General Montgomery, who we just looked at. And this force, Operation Torch, is led by General Dwight Eisenhower, who would then become the supreme commander of the British forces for the remainder of the war, later on becoming the President of the United States. But General Dwight Eisenhower led this as the supreme commander, and then General George Patton was, he was the leader on the ground. And there's a very famous movie that was made back in the 1970s called Patton, and it shows the life of Patton, and a lot of detail on the operations in North Africa are represented in that movie. Okay, so here's a map of Operation Torch, and you see the red lines here, the red arrows. This is the invasion, and so you see Morocco and Algeria and Tunisia. Okay, now these are the landings that take place, and this one's a pretty famous one because of a Humphrey Bogart movie called Casablanca, and they end up invading Casablanca. Now, the movie with Humphrey Bogart takes place while the Germans and the Vichy French are still in control of Casablanca, so it's before the invasion is that movie. But the forces land in Morocco, and they battle, and they win. The U.S. forces win, and they move across North Africa here. And at the same time, you have Montgomery moving from East North Africa to the west, and so basically he pushes the Germans out of Benghazi and pushes them. And these green lines are defensive lines of the Germans, but they keep getting pushed back. So here's Tripoli, all the way to here, and then here's Kasserine, and there's a very famous battle with the Americans there called the Battle of Kasserine Pass. And so basically what's happening is the Germans are getting pinched and pushed into northern Tunisia, where they're going to have kind of like a little siege of Tunis, and the Germans and Italians send some reinforcements here, but that's not enough. Again, by this time, Hitler is involved in Russia, so it's just not enough, and so the Germans get pushed all the way to this little tiny peninsula here, and they end up having to evacuate. And the Germans evacuate to Sicily and then evacuate to Italy. Now, Rommel has taken leave, and he's gone back to Germany at this time, but the forces end up hopping over to Sicily and then hopping over to Italy, and that's exactly what the Americans and the British do. They decide to follow, and they invade Sicily and then invade Italy. So this brings the war in North Africa to an end. November of 42 to May of 43 is the Allied victory, when they defeat Rommel's forces and basically take North Africa. So that ends the North African campaign. Here's a picture of Operation Torch with the U.S. soldiers landing in North Africa. May 13th, 1943, German forces defeated, and the Allies control North Africa. And that's all we're going to talk about with North Africa, but we have to switch gears now and look at the United States getting involved with the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. Now, there's 3 stages of U.S. involvement here, because the United States did not get involved until the very, very end of 1941. So the war has been going on for a good amount of time, 2 years or so, when Germany invaded Poland. So in 1939, so the first stage that the United States took was a stage of neutrality. They decided we're not going to get involved. They kind of had an isolationist mindset. They were over here still recovering from the Depression and getting back on their feet from that here in the United States. And so they kind of looked at this whole deal over there with Great Britain and Germany and all of that as Europe's problem. And at the beginning, 80% of Americans did not want to get involved in the European war. But because of the relations that we had with Great Britain, especially since the First World War, FDR decides to ensure neutrality in a speech to Congress on September 21st, 1939. However, in that speech, he decided to put forth, which got passed, a policy called cash and carry, which basically said they would sell non-war materials to Great Britain, but no war materials would be sold. So they would be able to sell food and other things to Great Britain, but no war materials. And that just kind of secured their United States neutrality. But because we looked at the England as an ally, that's not going to remain because of what takes place. So, in regards to the U.S. economy, it did help. It boosted non-war manufacturing, so that helped the U.S. economy. So FDR kind of knew what he was doing, keep the United States neutral while boosting the economy, and Great Britain can get some non-war material. But that's going to change to the Lend-Lease program in March of 1941, and this changed because really Great Britain was really hurting after the Battle of Britain, and so it was a loan scheme to loan war supplies to countries whose defense is vital for the U.S. defense. So by looking at this, they could say, well, if we give war material to Great Britain, that will actually help us defend our own country. And because everything was pointing towards war, they decided to pass this. So the slogan was Arsenal for Democracy. That was the slogan of the Lend-Lease program. And the idea was to lend war material mainly to Great Britain with the understanding that it would be repaid after the war. And then the third stage of U.S. involvement is the war itself. So it went from neutrality to Lend-Lease to we actually go to war. December 7, 1941, the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. U.S. Congress declares war on Japan on December 8, 1941, and that is the famous Day of Infamy speech by FDR with the attack on Pearl Harbor. And so we have to look at this before we jump into the actual attack on Pearl Harbor. We have to look at why the Japanese attacked the United States. If the United States was sitting over here neutral, not involved, if anything, they were giving war material to Great Britain, why is it that the Japanese got involved? Well, here's some reasons. First off, in September 1940, Japan signed the Tripartite Act with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. This brings the Axis forces together. And the conditions would outline how they would assist each other if attacked by a country not already involved in the war. So they're kind of like setting the stage. Number two, the U.S. enacted an oil sanctions on Japan after Japan invaded China in 1937. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail of this in any way, but just to let you know that in the 1930s, Japan invaded Manchuria, which is part of China, and had quite a bit of success, and they captured a good amount of China, especially in Manchuria. And when they did that, the United States enacted oil sanctions on Japan, and that's going to hurt Japan, especially when you get closer to the war, World War II itself. Number three, the Japanese occupation of French Indochina in July of 1941. So again, this is before Pearl Harbor. But that caused the U.S. to sever all commercial and financial relations with Japan. So things are just kind of going worse and worse with the relations between Japan and the United States. Japan signs with Nazi Germany. There's oil sanctions against Japan. Now there's severing of all commercial and financial relations. Number 4, Japan needed the U.S. Pacific Fleet out of the way to conquer Southeast Asia, because what they were doing is they were looking at an expansionist mindset and trying to see where natural resources are that they could use for their own war machine. Well, the U.S. fleet would be in the way of that and cause a problem, so they decided the U.S. fleet needs to be taken out. So the reasons for the attack: they need natural resources, especially oil. The U.S. froze all Japanese assets in the United States. So that means any kind of Japanese-owned businesses or just a way that money can go from the United States back to Japan. The United States froze all of that. And then the expansion threat. U.S. Pacific Fleet moved to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. And Japan looked at that as a provocation because in 1939, the U.S. fleet was not based in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. It was based in California. And it's a big deal to move an entire fleet to Pearl Harbor. Not only is it out in the middle of the Pacific, which is closer to Japan and closer to where Japan wants to invade, but it's a big deal to move a U.S. fleet out there. You have to build up the infrastructure, the airfields, the harbor, the docks. All of that has to be built up to prepare for an entire fleet of ships to be out there. So it's quite an undertaking, and the Japanese looked at this as a threat. So on the screen there is a map of the attack on Pearl Harbor. So you see how the Japanese carrier task force, they left Japan November 26th. Here's November 30th, December 1st. They sail all the way out here, and they come down, and this is where the planes would have taken off. They fly to Pearl Harbor, they bomb it, they come back, and then the fleet ends up returning back to Japan. Now down here is a couple of blue lines here and red lines. This is the 2 aircraft carriers, the Enterprise and the Lexington. Now the thing is that these aircraft carriers, they were out like on maneuvers and they were delivering things to Wake Island and all of that. They end up missing, the Japanese end up missing them because they're out here at sea and they bomb Pearl Harbor. Well, that was a big mistake because that left the carrier force. And an aircraft carrier doesn't just go out by itself. There's other ships that go out with it. The carrier force is now out here and they don't get bombed, which is a big mistake for Japan because that leaves the carrier force is still intact. Even though they did a lot of damage to battleships in Pearl Harbor, you still had the air arm of the United States surviving. Okay, so the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, it happened in 2 waves, and there's evidence that there was actually a plan for a 3rd wave that didn't happen. But there's the first wave at 7:40 a.m., Japanese planes attacked the U.S. fleet that was anchored at Pearl Harbor. They destroyed or damaged 20 ships, 8 being battleships. They destroyed 300 planes, and 2,400 servicemen are killed, including civilians, 1,000 wounded. The second wave, it comes an hour later at 8:40 a.m., 30 minutes after the first wave ended. Bombed military airfields, but another error that the Japanese did, even though they caused a lot of damage to ships, they failed to destroy dry docks, which is where ships can be repaired. They failed to destroy the fuel storages and ammo dumps. That all kind of remained intact, and so the United States could fight another day. Some of the U.S. losses, the USS Arizona, probably the most famous one, it was destroyed. It's still there today. One interesting note that I found was that 23 sets of brothers were on the Arizona and they all died. And there was one father and son pair that died on the USS Arizona. Also, the entire band, there was a naval band that was staying on the Arizona, and they all lost their lives. USS Oklahoma capsized and was later scrapped. USS California sank upright. It was raised and repaired, and it returned to the war. The USS West Virginia did the same thing. It sank upright, raised, repaired, and returned to war. USS Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Tennessee were damaged, but they were repaired and returned to war. And several cruisers and destroyers were damaged. And note, I've already mentioned it, U.S. aircraft carriers were not present because they were out on maneuvers doing some things out in the Pacific. Now, even though it was a tragedy and a lot of people lost their lives and some battleships were damaged, in reality, it didn't do a huge dent in the U.S. forces. It is a tragedy to lose 2 battleships, but the United States was able to rebound pretty quickly and bring the fight to Japan. Here's a couple of pictures. You see a Japanese plane here. They were called a Zero because of the Japanese symbol on the side. Here's an aerial photograph of Pearl Harbor. This is the harbor itself, and then the battleship Roe was over here. You can see a bomb exploding in the water. That's the USS Arizona after it exploded. This is the USS Arizona today, still on the bottom of the harbor, and you can come out and it's a memorial now, so because there's still men entombed in the ship, so you can go out here and see this. You see this kind of bluish color water here. That's oil still leaking from the Arizona today. Some estimates that they have is that about 9 quarts of oil leak out of the Arizona every day. So quite a bit. But there was a lot of oil on a battleship. So there are some declarations of war that take place. On December 7th, 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. On the 8th, the next day, the United States declares war on Japan. And then 3 days later, December 11, 1941, Germany declares war on the United States, and the United States declares war on Germany and Italy. And there's a picture of Hitler in the Reichstag after his declaration of war on Japan. And that's going to be it for this PowerPoint that we covered the North African campaign and then America coming into the war with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. I'll see you in a second. Okay, class, that's going to be it for this PowerPoint lecture. Next time, we're going to be getting into the war in the Pacific. I'll see you then.